So AU chairperson and Senegal's President Macky Sall has called for the removal of sanctions against Zimbabwe at the 77th UN General Assembly that's underway in New York. This as the United States and European Union are still concerned about human rights abuses and a lack of press freedom in that country. There are also concerns from the AU chair that Africa cannot afford to take sides since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which many of those African states have in fact refused to characterize, including South Africa, as an invasion. Now, African countries had faced a serious warning around a potential food shortage because of the blockage on the movement of grain as a result of that conflict. Let's talk about this with Priyal Singh, a researcher with the Institute for Security Studies. Welcome back, Priyal. Welcome to Daytime Update, I should say. Thank you so much for your time. So this call for the lifting of sanctions against Zimbabwe, what chance does it stand when you consider that even domestically, people are saying the situation there is in fact worsening?
Well, it's all good and well to call for the lifting of sanctions within the General Assembly. I think it's important to remember, though, that the sanctions imposed against Zimbabwe stem from various different sanctions regimes, from the United States to the European Union, the United Nations, and so on. So it's very difficult to kind of coordinate a wholesale lifting of sanctions. I think what's probably needed is for the chairperson of the African Union to engage more closely with the Southern African Development Community and with individual states from Southern Africa so that these states can put forward a much more compelling case on behalf of Zimbabwe within all of the various different multilateral appointments, be it on the General Assembly, the Security Council, and so on.
But it brings us back to the recurring argument, isn't it, from the African states that when you look at what Zimbabwe has essentially been punished for, there are still other countries that the West will sit with around the table that are guilty of pretty much the same treatment of their own people.
Absolutely, I would agree. I think we're facing a crisis in terms of double standards and hypocrisy being leveled by African states against the West and by the West against African states and against states from the global South in general. So there's a lot of double standards. There's a lot of hypocrisy. I mean, there's too many cases to mention in which we could say why impose these punitive measures against this particular case, whereas you don't do that for another case. So I think Zimbabwe unfortunately falls in a very difficult, kind of scenario. But what is really needed is just a much more uniform, consistent approach by African states to make a compelling case to the European Union, to the United States, to the United Nations, to lift these sanctions and to show that this is causing much more harm than good.
You talk about a sort of united front by African states, and I want to ask you how well the continent has done in doing that at a platform such as the United Nations, when you consider that America and its European allies often, almost always in fact, whether formally or informally, move in step when they want to get something done at the UN.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, I think the experiences of the last few years has thrown into very sharp relief how distant global developments can have very real on-the-ground impact on the stability and prospects for development amongst African states. The West has been surprisingly and overwhelmingly unified in their response, for example, to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And from the fallout of the COVID pandemic to the ongoing invasion of Ukraine, I think the last few years has shown us that Africa is very intricately interwoven into global supply chains, the global economy, and the strategic considerations of competing global powers. So African leaders need to better recognize the fact that drawing a line in the sand between what we think of as African crises and African conflicts versus those occurring in more distant parts of the world is becoming increasingly untenable from both a strategic and from a conceptual perspective. So African leaders need to much better band together and coordinate and cohere their approaches so that they can leverage their collective agency within multilateral forums, institutions like the General Assembly.
So, since the announcement of those Western sanctions against Russia after its military tanks rolled into neighboring Ukraine at the end of February, the West has responded with sanctions against Moscow, right? That's now led to a punishing effect, if you will, on their domestic populations in Europe, because there's the energy crisis. Now they're going into the winter, people not clear what they're going to do because they've relied so heavily on Russia. Some have suggested a look towards Africa in terms of plugging some of those gaps. Does that give South Africa then, not South Africa only, but broader Africa, a strategic edge in negotiating and getting some concessions from the West on whatever issue?
Absolutely. I think one of the strange and slightly perverse effects of this ongoing crisis is that it does lend much greater geostrategic significance to African states and to Africa as a collective, as global powers look to Africa as a battleground, well, not a physical battleground, but an ideological battleground to kind of support their competing worldview, to diversify the base of international partners economically, politically, strategically. And it depends on who you speak to, but many would argue that the sanctions imposed against Russia by the European Union, by European states and so on, did not necessarily lead to the kind of global food crisis and implications on energy security and so on. They put blame purely at the feet of Russia, at Moscow, for withholding those supplies, for kind of doing a tit-for-tat battle with Western partners and so on. So, I mean, just watching the recent General Assembly, the French president yesterday speaking very passionately about how can international actors, countries not impose sanctions, not want to impose these kinds of punitive measures. And I think this really cuts to the heart of the kind of competing worldviews and approaches that are being adopted by the West versus those amongst countries of the global South that are calling for negotiated political settlements, dialogue, and so on.
So the UN General Assembly is what's underway in New York this week, but the debate and, in fact, requests around giving Africa a permanent seat on the Security Council have been recurring every year almost. How close or further is Africa to that at this point, do you think? And would that be what ultimately guarantees a sort of serious voice for the continent in determining the positioning and the ideology, perhaps even, among the United Nations Security Council countries?
For those of us who have been following this issue for many years, I think many of us have become quite disillusioned with the states or the fact that there is no text-based kind of paper trail for countries to refer back onto to track the progress of reform of the Security Council. Everything up until this point has been verbal. There have been rhetorical statements made at different points by the United States, most recently last week, putting this as a major issue for consideration at this General Assembly. And even the conflict, I mean, coming out of COVID and the ongoing conflicts in Ukraine right now, I think it confers this kind of greatest geostrategic significance to Africa. And it will force global powers to much more greatly consider how this reform could happen. There's already incredible support from countries like Germany, other states from the global south supporting this. But the fact of the matter remains that the P5, the world's great powers, simply have not tabled any meaningful resolution. There's been no text-based agreements or anything for us to fall back on. So as far as I'm concerned right now, everything is just lip service. Everything is rhetorical up until we can get something on paper.
And when the U.S. Secretary of State, I beg your pardon, Antony Blinken was in South Africa, we got a lot of praise for the International Relations Minister, Lady Pandor, who said on that platform that she would not be bullied and that South Africa would not be bullied by any country in taking whatever position, ideologically or otherwise. But is that the general feeling among countries on the continent, or are they themselves doing the continent a disservice in not standing up when they should, precisely because people do fear that there may be the withdrawal of military or financial aid?
I think South Africa is unique amongst most African countries because South Africa has been the most vocal and outspoken in saying it won't be bullied. I think everyone is well aware of the fact that South Africa will not be bullied, but South Africa needs to match its rhetorical kind of statements, official statements within its bilateral engagements with the US, for example, within its multilateral engagements within the General Assembly, with tangible, meaningful action. That's what's missing. South Africa is just not putting its money where its mouth is in its foreign policy right now. As it calls for kind of like a negotiated settlements and calls for dialogue and mediation, what is South Africa tangibly doing? Has a mediator been appointed? Has a special representative been appointed? We have countries like Turkey, for example, that partnered with the Secretary General, who actually got into motion a very impactful negotiation to release grain from coming out of Ukraine.
Right.
South Africa, if it's being so vocal about these issues, needs to undertake meaningful actions. I think it needs to go well beyond its kind of rhetorical commitments right now.
Priyal Singh, a researcher with the Institute for Security Studies. A pleasure to speak to you. Thank you, sir.